Can please remain with us for the balance of this short panel, but the Foundation obviously wishes you well in the conclusion of this important task. We hope and we believe today has been helpful. You know that we're on a continuing journey ourselves. In fact, this Australia Summit reflects 18 months of work by working groups and a whole range of contributors to the Global Foundation processes. So it's no surprise we had the quality of contributions today. The really good news, folks, is that we are guided in our work by an advisory council which meets from time to time. And in fact, it was the first meeting that Ken and his panel had in consultative terms 6 months ago outside government circles was with the Advisory Council of the Global Foundation. So it's my pleasure to summarise in his own way and to bring proceedings to a close the Chairman of the Advisory Council, Mr. Fergus Ryan.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. Forgive me if I go back a little bit in time. Ken, I think we are complacent. I look back to 1995 and people were making speeches in Shakespearean terms. There is a tide in the affairs of men. The time is right. We need to position. There is a degree of urgency now. And when one looks back at the policy areas, or some of the policy areas, that we should have been looking at early, which have been not dealt with or badly dealt with, it's quite apparent that we have lost time. Let me start. I want to, in a strange sort of way, thank Dr. Prakash for her comments on the 3 Cs. I thought it was kind of light-hearted at first, cricket, Commonwealth and curry. But I thought, no, she's saying that's a narrow lens, widen it. I had an Indian friend. I've only had one real Indian friend who used to take me to the restaurant at India House to eat curries. That's all I know about India, was meeting students. And of course, that just simply underlines the importance of people to people. But her comment there, I think, on lens was just illustrative. Also, the Indian situation just simply underlines probably the major conclusion from our last meeting, which was, please, we need to be more sensitive, and we're not paying enough attention to those sensitivities, whether it be India or other countries. So in line with Dr. Prakash, I've got my 3 Cs, and they're very consistent with what Ken said, and they're to change culture and connectivity. Symbolically, I think I don't mean 3 separate areas. I mean, to the theologians amongst you, it's like the Trinity, 1 and 3, or to the Irish amongst you, it's like the Shamrock, 1 step from which 3 leaves emerge, i.e. it's got to be a whole of government sort of view of these 3 issues. In thinking of change, I'm a great fan of Charles Handy, who also happens to be Irish, and speaking of change, he said, because it's easy to explain things looking backwards, we think we can then predict them forwards. It doesn't work, as many economists know to their cost. The world keeps changing. It is one of the paradoxes of success that the things and the ways which got you where you are seldom the things to keep you there. So he goes on to talk about the sigmoid curve and change and doing new things, very similar to the next wave, I thought, just another way of expressing it. I was inspired by that back in about 1995. And it actually, which was about the time of the Australian Constitutional Convention. And I wrote an article for CEDA at the time called Advance Australia Where. And it's amazing how much has not changed. And again, I come back to your point, Ken, on urgency. One thing that has changed, struck me today, was back then, the catchphrase was think global and act local. The former is correct. We've got to think global, that's obvious. But I think it's a new local. It's not the local we remember. Sure, it's community, but when you look at whether it's the arts or it's Warrnambool, people locally are acting globally, so it's a whole new concept. And I think we underestimate how educated Australians have become to that under the excellent sort of local leadership we saw evidence today. The other thing that struck me today was we talked about branding and so on. I think mindset is the right word, but it's got to be a very educated mindset, and it's got to be a mindset that we Australians don't reach together. It's got to be participative, and we have to have both sides of the equation. We have to be good listeners, and I'm delighted that you've been travelling along those lines. So mindset is critically important, and philosophy, as we've said, does matter. The other point that I thought was important was back in '95 was really the last deep conversation we had about issues on long-term planning and so on the Constitutional Convention. And we do need some sort of values statement because we need something we can point people to inspire them to be aspirational. The Americans have it in their constitution. Others do, some don't. But I'm struggling to see what it might be. I wrote back then, I suggest we look to revising the Constitution in a manner which recognises the realities of the world in which we live and the values by which we want to live. I see a document that has a higher meaning and objective than our present Constitution, a document to which Australians turn with pride for both continuity and direction. It critically contains an informal prologue to the legal form of what is currently described as the Australian Constitution Act. I'm clearly describing a document which is much wider in its construction and use than our existing Constitution. It is a document that would provide us with a sense of history and direction and an inspiring framework on which to move forward. You can, of course, yeah. So I don't know whether that's the right answer, but when Greg talks about 30-year planning, the Archbishop talks about values, we need to think, I think, about some sort of preamble that binds us together. I won't say much about culture. I thought the Western civilization point linking with Asia was great. None of these things are either or, but they're all and I think we do have too much either or sort of discussions. The point on symbolism, as was said, again, back in that period of time, we used to talk about competitiveness and fairness, which are still good Aussie words, but I think it's interesting now that one senses that the competitiveness has become about productivity, which is a much broader sense, productivity in the best and full sense of the word, and the fairness, the fair go, if you like, I think in that global terms is more about justice, i.e. bigger issues. Connectivity, a great session. In the interest of time, I'll skip over that. But in doing so, let me say that the Global Foundation essentially is about connectivity. That's what it does. That inevitably embraces culture and an openness and enthusiasm for change. So in a strange kind of way, I think I've certainly in my mind come full circle today that we're not called the Global Foundation for nothing. I think we are dealing with the right issues. Our unique feature is that we are citizens rather than anything else, and therefore the cross-section works wonderfully well. So, Steve, I congratulate you on, and the team on putting this together. I think it not only dealt with the right subject, but it's reaffirmed why the Global Foundation is there and should inspire you to go even better. Thank you.
Thank you to Fergus Ryan. Thank you to Dr. Ken Henry, and thank you to my co-moderator, Dr. Jacqueline Dutton.